We're looking at the reproduction and human development in this lecture. To begin, the reproductive anatomy specifically of the male. This is a sagittal section showing some of the reproductive structures, and we'll start with the place that sperm are produced, and we'll go through the entire pathway that they would travel in the event of ejaculation and then also fertilization of an egg. One of the interesting things about the male anatomy is that there is a tube here called the urethra that runs along the penis. And that tube is shared by both the urinary tract and the reproductive tract. So this is the place where the two combine. This tube that you're seeing here is called the ejaculatory duct. That's where the reproductive system is going to enter into that common passageway. And then this would be the urinary bladder with the urethra. So these will come together at this point, and then from here it's the urethra. It's a shared tube between the urinary and reproductive tract. That's unique to the male. It's different in the female anatomy. In the female anatomy, you have a separate tract for each system: reproductive tract and urinary tract. All right. So when sperm are produced, they're produced in the testes, and if you were to look at a picture of the testes, you'd see it's a whole network of tubes, and sperm are made in the middle of the tube. So if I was to enlarge this even further and we were to look at a seminiferous tubule, you'd see a whole bunch of cells here inside the tube. There'd be a whole bunch of cells near the periphery of the tube, and those would be stem cells that are continually replenishing themselves. And as they're replenishing, their daughter cells are undergoing meiosis and turning into sperm. Now this is unique because this is a snapshot here of meiosis. Meiosis, recall there's two, well, let me back up. Recall that there are two cellular division processes. There's mitosis and there's meiosis. Mitosis is what happens for most every other cell in your body, and mitosis makes identical copies of cells. Meiosis happens only in one spot, and specifically it's just right here in the portions of the seminiferous tubule, and it's responsible for making gametes. And what's unique about a gamete is it has a haploid genome. Haploid means it has one half of the chromosomes that all the other cells in your body have. And this is good because when a sperm and an egg fertilize, they combine their genomes together to create the fertilized egg, which eventually becomes you. And because you have two nuclei combining, they each have to have half of the normal number of chromosomes so that when they combine, it yields a cell that has the same number of chromosomes as the rest of your cells. So meiosis will make these haploid cells, and it's happening here in the male in the seminiferous tubule. Okay, from here, all of the roads lead to the epididymis, and the epididymis is going to be a track where they will pass through, and I like to call the epididymis, I call it sperm boot camp. It's where they learn they program and learn how to swim, they acquire their motility, and by the time they get through here, they mostly just shut off, and they are passively carried up this tube here, which is called the ductus deferens. You may have also heard it called the vas deferens. Okay, so the ductus deferens, sperm are passively carried up this tube, up and around the pubic bone, and then back around through here. Now, if you're looking, you're going to see there's a little enlarged portion of it right there at the very end of the tube, and that's called the ampulla. And that will be the place that sperm are stored prior to ejaculation. And sperm are continually being stored here, and so in the male anatomy, what can happen is if they aren't released, eventually they have to get out somehow. And so a man would generally have a nocturnal emission. They would be ejaculated while he's sleeping at night. Okay, right alongside the ampulla then is a gland called the seminal vesicle. And the seminal vesicle will be releasing some fluids, and together, right prior to ejaculation, the sperm and those fluids will mix together. Now, there's a substance called semen, and semen is going to be a combination of sperm cells plus a fluid. And there are a variety of different types of things that contribute to the fluid. There is the seminal vesicle, there's the prostate gland, and then these little bulbourethral glands here. So 3 glands secreting substances that will provide things to the sperm, things like energy, things like vitamins and antibodies and other types of immune things to protect them along their journey. One of the most significant contributors, though, is the seminal vesicle. All right, then just prior to ejaculation, the ampulla will contract, and this will contract, and those substances will mix together. Now is the first time since leaving the epididymis that the sperm are actually now active, and they're motile. And as they pass through the urethra and as they enter into the female reproductive tract, they're going to be acquiring different, or being subjected to different biochemical events that are making them more and more motile. They're making them more and more able to fertilize an egg, and this is all called, it's a process known as capacitation. It's giving sperm the capacity they need to fertilize an egg. Okay, some of the other things we can see here, there is on the penis, the tip of it is called the glans, and the glans is a place where there's a lot of sensory receptors, so it's highly sensitive. There is covering the glans a fold of skin, which is called the prepuce, and this would also be called the foreskin. And this is the thing that's removed during circumcision. Now, circumcision is, it's a little bit of an interesting thing. It used to be more common in the United States. I think it's maybe becoming less common. The reason why it was done earlier was both for religious and then also some medical reasons. It was thought that removing the foreskin would prevent irritation to the penis, which I believe it does. But you know, somebody that has their foreskin, if they're taking showers and bathing and things regularly, you know, once or twice or 3 times a week, there's no real risk here of there being an infection or inflammation of this tissue. So I think the medical reasons were maybe there, but not necessarily all that significant. More of it, I think, came from just a cultural or a religious background. Specifically in Judaism, I mean, this is a requirement that you would have the prepuce removed. Okay, in either case, that's a little story there. Okay, also in the penis there is erectile bodies. So these are just tissues that can fill with blood, and when they do, they create hydrostatic pressure, which makes the penis erect. So there's sort of a misconception. I think sometimes people think it's like a muscle contracting or something else, but it's really just filling a hollow space with fluid to make it rigid and erect. Yeah, and that's some of the structures here of the male anatomy. Testes, epididymis, vas deferens, ampulla, the seminal vesicle, prostate gland, then following with the urethra. I should point out too, the prostate gland is like it's almost like a donut-shaped gland that the urethra passes through. This can enlarge over time. It can swell, and so generally, like when a male is in their 50s, they'll have to have prostate exams, and the physician will place his fingers up into the rectum and be able to palpate the prostate gland, and they're assessing to see how enlarged it is. And men, if it's getting enlarged, it'll be a little bit more of a challenge to void their urinary bladders because this is pushing and constricting it. Men will also get prostate cancer, and the likelihood of this will increase as a man ages. And I've heard it said, I don't entirely know if it's true, but I've heard it said that any man, if they live long enough, will get prostate cancer, that the likelihood just continues to get more and more likely. And then, you know, let's say if a man lived to be like 110, every single man living to that age would get it. And I'm not exactly sure why this is the case. I'm not exactly sure how true that is, but that's what I've heard. That's what I've been told. Okay, this is the female anatomy, and the first thing to point out is the difference between the urinary tract and the reproductive tract. Okay, so this is the urinary tract here, and then this is the reproductive tract here. They're kept totally separate, and the external genitalia of the female anatomy is interesting in the sense that at one point they were very similar. Okay, so there's a structure here called the clitoris, and the clitoris has erectile tissue in it. The clitoris also has a little tip to it that has a highly sensitive area. It's a high abundance of sensory receptors there. And so the glands of the penis and the glands of the clitoris are similar in that respect. There's also these erectile bodies, and if you look at the positioning of this, like the base of the clitoris is right underneath the pubic bone, and that's a similar spot here. So at one point they were very similar structures in embryonic development. And I forget what the week is, but it's like so many weeks in they start to differentiate. But it started off as being very similar, which I think would be counterintuitive to most people. Okay, so this is the vagina. This is the womb. This is the uterus. And the gateway into the uterus is this little opening here called the cervix. And you'll note how thick the muscle is in this womb. This will get stretched way out. So keep that in mind. It has the ability to do that. And it will be the contractions of the muscle in this womb which will push a baby out of the vagina, should that ever come to pass, should the woman ever get pregnant. Okay, this is the ovary right here. This would be like the male. This would be analogous to the testes in the male. So it's the place where gametes are made. It's the only place in the female anatomy where gametes are made. There is this little funnel-like structure here called the infundibulum, and there's a big long tube, which is called the uterine tube. Or it's also called the fallopian tube. And how it works is that an egg is going to be ovulated or released from the ovary once a month, generally. And that will pass through and maybe get fertilized and implant and then become a baby. If not, it will pass all the way through. And also, the uterus and the ovary are somewhat synchronized, because the uterus will be the place that a embryo could implant and then start to grow, and it needs to be ready if that does happen. So the ovary and the uterus talk to one another, and this is called the synchronization of the ovarian and uterine cycles, and we'll talk just briefly about a little bit what that synchronization looks like and how it all works. But in essence, that's a survey of the anatomy. Here we have the labia minora, the labia majora, the two labii that are going to sheath the reproductive organs. There's the clitoris, there is the vagina, the cervix, the uterus, the fallopian tube, and the ovary. Now the ovary has got this ligament here called the ovarian ligament, and students are tempted to think that this is the fallopian tube, so that would be one thing to keep in mind, is that this little thing here is not actually a tube, it's just a strap that keeps the ovary in place. The tube that carries the egg is the one that has these little feathery structures on it that's attached to the ovary. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about human development then. Here's what it looks like for an egg to be fertilized. It needs to, so what happens, I guess, let me back up, is an egg is ovulated from the ovary, and then it passes into this funnel, and then it starts to travel down the fallopian tube. Now, if fertilization is going to lead to the implantation of a viable embryo, fertilization needs to happen up here closer to the very end of the fallopian tube. The reason for this is that there's a sheath that wraps around this cell called the zona pellucida, and the embryo almost needs to hatch out of that before it can attach to the endothelial or the epithelial cells of the endometrium here. Well, that hatching doesn't really happen until about day 5. Okay, so it takes about 5 days for this to pass all the way down and get to the uterus, and so it also takes 5 days for that zona pellucida to erode away. And this is actually a clever mechanism. It keeps implantation from happening up into this tube, which would be a bad thing. When that happens, it's called an ectopic pregnancy, and it can actually be a pretty severe event. It can require surgical intervention to prevent a growing embryo from growing in the uterine tube. The uterine tube isn't equipped to handle a developing embryo, and so it could lead to a lot of damage if there is implantation there. All right, so like if fertilization happened here, by the time the zona pellucida is gone, the fertilized egg will already be too far past. It won't be in the uterus anymore. So fertilization needs to happen way up here, so that day 5, the zona pellucida is now off, and now it can implant. So it's a pretty specific place that fertilization needs to happen. It needs to happen about right here, which means that it has to happen in a pretty narrow window. Fertilization has to happen within, like, a 24 or 36 hour window generally. It's not a very long window. Okay, these are some of the structures that would first be seen in a developing embryo. So let's say that the egg was fertilized. Well, first it divides into 2 cells, and then those divide into 4 cells, and then those divide into 8 cells, and then 16 cells. And at this point, it's a big ball of cells. From here, then it gets into 32 and then 64 cells. Eventually, it starts to look like a hollow ball of cells, and there is some fluid in the middle. And then that is going to be called the blastocyst, and that will be the thing that attaches to the endometrium. And then it'll start to proliferate. Okay, let's talk then about how the ovary and the uterus talk to one another to make sure that conditions are adequate for implantation of a developing embryo. So one of the things that's going to happen here is once the egg is ovulated, there will be a bunch of cells that were wrapped around it, and they were protecting it, and now they stay back in the ovary, and they turn into this really important organ called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum creates this hormone known as progesterone, and progesterone goes and tells the uterus to proliferate. Blood supply to the uterus increases. There's glands in the uterus that secrete this thick sugary substance that coats the lining of the uterus and creates a bed of nutrients for an embryo should it implant. And that's really important. Remember, a little ball of cells doesn't have a blood supply. It doesn't have a cardiovascular system. And when it's growing, it requires nutrients for it to grow. Well, the place that it gets those nutrients is from this sugary mucus that is coating the uterus. Without that there's no nutrients for it to grow. Eventually this thing will tap into one of mom's blood vessels, and then it will be hooked up to the pipeline. But until that event happens, it needs to rely on some surface nutrients here. And that's all provided through the actions of progesterone. Progesterone is what causes the secretion of that nutrient-rich bed of substances, and it's made by the corpus luteum. So if we look at the ovarian uterine cycle, this is a cool figure that shows what's happening in the ovary and also what's happening in the uterus. Now, one of the things I didn't show you is that for an egg to become mature, it has to go through this whole process known as follicular development, which I'm not going to go into all the complexity of it. You can see it here. So this would be like a very simple egg. This is an egg with a bunch of cells around it. Here's an egg with more cells around it. Here's an egg with more cells around it. This is the egg right here. That's what's happening in the ovary. And then eventually this thing gets ovulated, and all the rest of these cells stick back and become the corpus luteum. One of the triggers for ovulation is a big spike in luteinizing hormone. So what's interesting is that luteinizing hormone is not released. Even though it's being made, it's not released as this follicle is developing. And then eventually there will become a point where it is released, so it leads into a big spike. It's all dumped out of the anterior pituitary gland. It causes a big spike in luteinizing hormone in the blood. Well, that's the cue to the body that it's time to kick the egg out, and so the egg gets ovulated, and then it passes now into through the infundibulum. So that's one important event here of the timing of everything. And then remember that all of these cells that are left over become the corpus luteum. That starts making progesterone, so you start to see the progesterone levels increase. You'll also see that with progesterone levels increasing, you're also seeing a proliferation of the inner lining of the uterus. So this is like a snapshot of the very innermost layer of the uterus. You can see it's not very thick. It gets thicker, it gets thicker, it gets thicker, and these blood vessels extend and extend and extend. That's all paired with the elevation in progesterone. So that's one of the big drivers of that. Okay, now if there is fertilization of an egg and there is an embryo developed, progesterone levels will stay high, and so the endometrium will stay robust. But if there is no fertilization, then progesterone levels drop. And if it drops, now there's no longer enough hormonal influence to keep this endometrium vascularized and growing, so it sloughs off. And that's what's going to lead to menstruation, is the actual sloughing of this vascularized endometrium. All right, pregnancy can be divided up into 3 trimesters that are between 12 and 14 weeks each. And during the first trimester, this is when most of the organs are being made. Okay, so this is a very sensitive time. Anything that goes wrong in the first trimester can be pretty catastrophic regarding the development of an embryo. Most miscarriages would generally happen during the first trimester, and that can be a pretty a really hard thing to go through. My wife and I lost our first baby through a miscarriage, and it was really tough. But usually if they get past the first trimester, then all of the organs are formed, all of the most major significant developmental challenges have been met, and at that point it's just a matter of adding on weight and getting bigger, and just some final development of some features. Okay, now there's a big threshold here between week 8 and week 9. Prior to week 8, this is all still considered an embryo, so this is called embryonic development. Sorry, embryo. Beyond 8 weeks, this is now called fetal development, and so this then would be called a fetus. Okay, 8 weeks is the cutoff between those. Now, a baby could be born as soon as about 24 weeks. That would be a very really early baby, and it all sort of depends on the mass. If the baby is less than, I think they usually say about 600 grams, it probably can't survive outside of the womb. If the baby is more than 600 grams, so that would be like a little more than a pound, then it would have a chance at surviving outside of the womb. And so a baby can be born anywhere in here and make it. And so that basically goes to show you that most of the baby has been developed by the second trimester, and the third trimester is just all about putting more and more mass on and more fat to make for a healthy, strong baby. Okay, some of the changes that a mom would be going through as she's pregnant, we call this the gestational changes. Gestation is a fancy word for pregnancy. And here's some of the things that would be going on. First and foremost, most of mom's organs are squished up closer to her liver. And this is going to also greatly affect the size of her stomach. So her stomach is being pushed, and that means that there's less room for it to expand. And so if things go into the stomach and if acid is produced in the stomach, there's a greater tendency for it to have sort of a backwards accumulation and start to scorch the esophagus. So it's not uncommon for women to get a lot of heartburn when they're pregnant for that reason. There is also, you can see here, this is the urinary bladder, and so the baby's head is squishing down the urinary bladder, so it's doesn't have as much room for expansion, and also mom has taken on about 50% more blood. And with 50% more blood, there's more of a blood pressure within mom. Her blood pressure is higher. That's going to lead to actually a greater increase in the amount of urine produced. So between not having as much space for the urine to go and also producing more urine, it's going to make it such that mom has to go to the bathroom a lot more frequently. Also, interestingly here, that because there is more blood made and because it is increasing the blood pressure, occasionally in some women they'll have too high of a blood pressure, and if it gets too high, it can actually start to cause damage to some organs. It can lead to some shutdown of events happening in organs, and that's called eclampsia. And preeclampsia would be getting into a zone where the blood pressure is that high. And so if a woman is having a blood pressure that's too far outside of a normal range, they might induce the delivery of the baby to try and alleviate some of that strain of that extra blood pressure, of that extra blood, and the increase in blood pressure that it brings about. So those are some of the major changes. You have all of the digestive organs being squished up here. It's reducing the size of the stomach. You've got more blood. You have more urine being produced and less place for it to go. There's also, the woman would generally breathe more. She's already going to be experiencing some proliferation of her mammary glands, so the breast tissue would start to be enlarging. And I will never be able to understand what this feels like. I will never understand what it's like to have a human inside of your abdominal cavity, but I've been told it's not very pleasant. It is a highly uncomfortable feeling like none other, and all the more reason to give your mother some extra praise and adoration next time you see her, if she's still living. Moms go through a lot to bring about a human onto this planet. Okay, the last thing then, if that wasn't all enough, there is the final chapter here in the story of the developing baby, and that is parturition. This is childbirth. Childbirth has got a couple phases to it. And the thing that's governing childbirth is what's known as a positive feedback loop. And I don't know if you can recall, but earlier in the class, we talked about this thing known as homeostasis. Homeostasis is the tendency for your body to maintain certain conditions, and if they get out of line, your body wants to return back to those set points. Well, one of the things that can happen is what's known as a positive feedback loop, and that's something that actually makes homeostasis worse, and it continues to get worse until there's some resolve, and that's the type of feedback we see here governing childbirth. So here's how it works. The baby's head pushes against the cervix, and that's going to cause a distension of the cervix, and it's going to send those nerves that are in the cervix are going to send signals to the brain that says, hey, I'm being pushed upon, and that will cause the pituitary gland to create oxytocin. Well, the oxytocin then will go to the bloodstream back to the uterus, where it will cause a contraction. So if the distension is enough to release enough oxytocin, that is going to lead to actual contraction of this muscle. It takes a certain threshold of oxytocin to do that. But if that threshold is ever met, then this is going to cause a strong contraction of the uterus that's going to open this more, and now we have this cycle because the cervix gets distended, more oxytocin release causes a contraction, the baby's head gets pushed further, opens up the cervix, causes another rush of oxytocin, causing stronger contraction, the baby's head pushes the cervix even further, so the cervix keeps getting pushed further and further apart. Every time it does, it leads to another increased surge of oxytocin. It's going to continue to push the baby out more forcefully until eventually it comes out. Okay, and then that's only part of it because the baby also is hooked up to the placenta, which is right here. It's an organ that's nourishing the baby. And so the baby will be born, and then there's what's called the afterbirth, that the placenta will have to be cleared from the womb. And that's actually really important. If the placenta or any of the membranes or any of that are left in the womb, it can lead to an infection. So it all has to be cleaned out, and generally a woman's body will do this naturally. And then generally the baby will come first, and then they'll put the baby on mom and let them have some skin-to-skin time, and then they'll cut the cord of the umbilical cord, and then the placenta will come later and they'll pull it out. But this is some of the feedback mechanisms at play here, making it such that the contractions get stronger and stronger until the baby's eventually born. All right, there we have it, a little survey of the reproductive organs and human development and childbirth.